A few years ago, at the Conservative Political Action Conference, there was a panel entitled, "If Heaven Has a Gate, a Wall, and Extreme Vetting, Why Can't America?" The weaponizing of the sacred to establish borders and to desacralize those who seek to cross those borders, as well as those whom the border crossed, and to subsequently provide divine justification for the violence employed those positioned as inferior, excluded, and other, has received scant attention in the manifold conversations about migration, borders, and race. My guest today, Associate Professor Gregory Cuéllar, seeks to address this gap. His new, detailed, weighty, and vital work, Resacralizing the Other at the US-Mexico Border, a Borderland Hermeneutic, out now with Routledge, provides a much-needed, substantive response to the state's use of sacralization to justify its acts of violence, and offers new ways of theologizing the acceptance of the other in its place. We talk about the way the sacred is weaponized by elite powers to shape the social reality, the way it grants permanence to the negating of the inherent sacred worth of the black and brown bodies of those approaching or crossing the border, while sacralizing the Anglo-American project of colonization, violence, and manifest destiny. We talk about how, counterintuitively, appealing to the sacredness of the other can provide a way toward a healing strategy, and how the book seeks to attend in a healing way to the recurring open wounds of postcoloniality at the US-Mexico border. Wounds that are, for the author, personal. My name is Liam Miller. This is Love, Rinse, Repeat, and today's guest is Gregory Cuéllar. Well, Gregory Cuéllar, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat.
Thank you for having me.
It's really exciting. We're going to be talking today about your book, Resacralizing the Other at the US-Mexico Border, a Borderland Hermeneutic, out with Routledge. Maybe just as a brief overview, let us know a little bit about yourself for those who have never come across you before, and I guess what led to writing this book. As I often talk with my guests, it's writing a book is a decent amount of effort. you've got to have some level of motivation to decide I'm going to put a bunch of time into this. So I guess what for you led to this?
Well, I'm a 8th generation Texan. My family have been in the region since the 18th century. So when it comes to issues of borderlands, I grew up hearing a lot about those issues early on. And, whether it be just stories that I heard from my grandparents or things that I read, just living in the region, you develop this innate sense for what's going on around you. And I think that just culminated as I advanced further in my doctoral work and my own research abilities, having the ability just to raise the issues that are current to the Texas-Mexico border, but also the historical background that has led to much of what we are seeing today on the U.S.-Mexico border. So it's mainly something that comes from my own family background, my own cultural upbringing. My social location is the Texas-Mexico border. And so it just developed out of that.
Thanks for that, and I think we'll get partly into that later on, where you talk about this book, and it's caring and healing and about wounds that are not just out there but are personal. So we might get around to that soon. People might have guessed from the book, from the title of the book, that the sacred as a concept and the sacred and its power is key to the book and its argument. But one of the important points you establish right off the bat is that the sacred can be stripped of its otherworldliness by its use for and by elite powers of society. So the sacred then, is not just not by necessity, some kind of uncontrollable other out there that we can't possibly look upon or get our hands on, but something that can be controlled by elite powers to shape social reality, often for, in this case, rather wicked and violent ends.
So can you talk to us a little bit about how you know, I guess, configure the sacred in the book, and maybe kind of any kind of just easy wading in examples of how it can be weaponized?
Yeah, I think that's, so there's a combination of elements that I'm drawing on. One has to do with my own research as an archivist, working at a public university, and in their archive, I was exposed to the entire process of archiving material. And the archive being in Texas, there was a lot of interest on Texas history. And seeing how the institution of an archive regulates what is worthy of collecting, what is worthy of being put in its repository and then declared as evidence for historical claims. That process for me reflected a sacralization of information, a sacralization of history by the very institution itself. And there's the politics that undergirds that process of archiving history, not just what is chosen, but what is excluded. And seeing the exclusions, for me, pointed to a desacralization of histories, cultures, identities. And so that was sort of that's the basis from which I'm then critiquing other domains within the public sphere where the state seeks to invest in what is considered sacred, whether it be the notion of citizenship, whether it be monuments, whether it be the specific profiles of people. You know, the warrior mentality, I think, is the male warrior persona is also one that is sacralized. And so all of these elements and these various domains are converging to see this broader system, broader operations of power taking hold of belief, taking hold of those areas of thought or way of looking at the world that can lead to controlling people's activities, controlling people's ways of socially organizing themselves. So that there are, you know, a lot of these in this area, this sort of convergence. You know, I'm interested in seeing that, you know, these investments, how you have nefarious power systems that are opportunistically looking for ideologies, they're looking for forces that bring collectives together, sparks their imagination, and that has some level of authority, and then use that as a way of perpetuating violence and perpetuating motives and agendas that may not lead to sort of a, you know, a democratic situation, you know, a democratic state. You know, it's more of a narrow view of you know, who has access and who doesn't. So that, I mean, these are some of the things that I'm trying to flesh out in the book, is that how the sacred as an area of influence can be a place of investment for power structures that want to perpetuate a vision of the world or a way of operating in the world that dehumanizes that can lead to mass violence and the oppression of large populations. And that's sort of that's how it culminates. And in the book, I'm following the evolution of manifest destiny as one of those ideological elements that is drawing on history, it's drawing on archive, it's drawing on folklore, it's bringing multiple areas that have some level of authority within society and forcing these areas, forcing all of these multiple authorities into this notion of the sacred, and then harnessing that for nefarious purposes. And I think that's been something that has been understudied in not just migration studies, border studies, how the sacred was so instrumental as a viable domain of investment for power structures, elite power structures like the state, to advance certain agendas that in their full effect, we could see that they only benefit a minority of the population while excluding mass populations, othering mass populations in the process. So there's an ethic also involved in that evolution of the sacred's authority that elite power develops, cultivates.
Thank you for that. I think that kind of started to get to another question I wanted to ask, which was, because as you say, there's lots of writings about migration and the border, and so I was curious about what is gained by approaching through this lens of the sacred, right? Through not neglecting the concept of the sacred. And you early in the book you spend a lot of time with a sermon by a military chaplain at the end of the US-Mexico War, and you're kind of talking about the evocation of Almighty God and how in that sermon there's, even before kind of any appeal to these people as criminality, there's a defect in their concept of the sacred, and that is what needs to be addressed, and that this appeal to the sacred allows for a sense of permanence. That what is wrong now in 2 centuries ago will always be wrong, and thus will always need to have this dynamic. And then that's similarly found then in language around treaties, which establish border in a way that it makes it seem natural or sacred, that this is the geography of where this border goes, and again that becomes thus a state of permanence, even though it is a in the grand scheme of human history and civilization very modern. So can you talk a little bit about that? What is, because you're not setting this up as, and thus this invalidates any other way of exploring and speaking about what's going on at the border, but this is an often overlooked or underappreciated concept. What are some of the things like that kind of concept of permanence that are kind of gained through picking up sacred as the kind of the key hermeneutical tool?
Yeah, I think that's what makes the sacred attractive to elite power structures, is that it has the potential to render permanent certain social realities. And so when you have a conquering empire, at least at the 19th century, when you had the Manifest Destiny and US expressing its imperialism on the Republic of Mexico, that they're identifying those elements of the sacred that can lead to permanence. Permanence not just of ideas, but permanence of presence, permanence of structures, permanence of institutions. And so that becomes, and I see this mostly at the initial stages of gaining some foothold within a colonized territories. That you have the colonizer starting out by harnessing these sacred domains and sacred ideas, those areas that have accrued authority as sort of a carrying a religiosity. You know, there's definitely elements of the divine present there, but there's also this accrued and accumulated investments that have been made through religion, mainly organized religion, and building these authorities up of the sacred. And so the state converges on those opportunities and sees them as ways to create permanence for elite power structures. So it's not a very, I mean, I don't see it as a casual or benign appeal or recourse to religious language in treaties or in formal sermons as a way of just framing secular thought. It's the portal that is where you enter in through the sacred to establish the secular, to establish that permanency of state power. And you could see that throughout all much of the language in the treaties that established what is now the Texas-Mexico border. You know, the Treaty of Hidalgo starts off with an invocation to the divine, both in English and in Spanish. Sermons that were preached at the culmination of the Mexican-American War commemorate not just the defeat of the Mexican army and its colonization, but it also establishes this sense of permanency for Anglo-American dominance in the region. And you know, being here in the Western Hemisphere, we are very much confronted with a racial logic that is intertwined with the sacred. So what has been cultivated as a sacred idea or sacred belief is the inferiority of non-white populations. That is, you know, you either confirmed using Christian scripture, theology, even the Protestant church, as a way of bolstering this notion of Anglo-American superiority. That is something that has been rendered permanent in much of the social structures surrounding the Texas-Mexico border, the US-Mexico border. You know, the inferior is on the outside and needs to be excluded. And that exclusion stems from this sacralized notion that there is a superior population, there's a superior being on earth, that God has designated certain physiognomies to be superior than others. Science can do, you know, science has a certain ability to, you know, capture the imagination and galvanize a collective around a particular agenda using empirical evidence. But the sacred, it is still one of those quintessential domains for elite power to tap into and mine that domain for what it can produce in terms of you know, perpetuating certain social structures. There's something about the it's this appeal to the divine that allows for state power, elite power, to solidify itself for the long term, and it not be in any way inhibited, or that there's very little room for response, because God said this. Right? This is from the divine.
And I think that's, like, as you say, establishing that kind of concept of supremacy, establishing that concept of borders, which thus creates an outsider who is inferior. And then the way then that appeal to the sacred then, obviously justifies then violence, as a divinely justifies violence as a protection of what has been seen as superior, protection of sovereignty, citizenship, these things. And that violence can then take, all manner of forms, from, individual kind of ad hoc violence, but also institutional structures that impose violence on bodies. But then also the way it creates attitudes in the body politic that justify that violence. So I was thinking about, you were talking about, like, so there's the desacralizing power made possible, this weaponizing of the sacred that affords the one wielding the power the negating the sacred worth of the other. So they can negate what we should think is inherently sacred in another, particularly in the case of black and brown bodies approaching or crossing the border. And I guess what that brought up for me was that there's this, even merciful acts, so to speak, of offering water become in themselves political, or if not illegal. And I was drawn to this quote later, where you're kind of talking about, like, the way state-sponsored care and the border and all this, that what is grossly evil is how this elite complex of control is able to convince the body politic that certain humans are unworthy of full access to life's resources solely on the basis of their darker color, of their darker skin color. Sorry. And so I was thinking about this relationship between taking away that, negating that sacred, and its relationship to then taking away the basic stuff of human survival and human living. And if you had any thoughts to share there.
Yeah, and that is how, in sort of mapping the trajectory that elite power takes. And I'm talking about, when I say elite power, I'm referring to power that seeks to colonize. That is what we see as the initial impetus, are what brought forth the Mexican-American War, and then led to the formation. You have the colonization of half of the Republic of Mexico's territory, and then the creation of this geographical border. So that, when you follow the use of the sacred, there's the permanency that is an objective. You're using your time, your resources, you're investing in the sacred, so that you can create a permanent situation. You can create a permanent society for those you have deemed as members of that sacred narrative, that sacred meta narrative. But there's another, I think, element that is the byproduct of those investments, and that has to do with the use of violence. You create a domain that is evil, and that evil takes on a physical form, a human body, and then you are able to, so you create you demonize this other those who are non-members of the sacred narrative. And that's part of where the violence starts. It's you are reformulating the sacred to perpetuate elite power structures. And in order to do that, you have to create an evil. This construction of the evil. Much like the divine is in the cosmic that is being appealed to in order to recreate this elite powers sacred. You're also having to appeal to in the cosmic to this evil domain that you're constructing, and that evil domain has physical form. And within the logic, the racial logic that has permeated the investments of the sacred here in this part of the world, especially as it pertains to the formation of the US-Mexico border, right? You're talking about Black and brown-bodied people who have been designated as the enemy of the states or the elite powers' sacred narrative. So there's the ideological violence that happens that then leads to the physical violence. And you then desensitize yourself. You are able to distance yourself from the humanity of those who have been designated as the other, as the domain of the evil, and set in motion, an entire gamut of violent operations. It really doesn't. It's this is where I hadn't incorporated a lot of Akile Mbembe's work on necropolitics. I was mainly trying to flesh out what I had experienced from my own social location and wanting to theorize on that. But I think Akile Mbembe would resonate with the ultimate extent of what it starts off as ideological, then can end up in genocide. And there be complete justification for the mass annihilation of bodies without any question. And they're seen simply as that, as enemies of the state, enemies of elite power that have been conquered and that need to be eradicated. That's what makes the sacred then so dangerous when it does take on these investments by elite power. It's not to better our notion of the sacred, it's to harness the sacred to annihilate human beings. And that, for me, is a fundamental ethical issue that we need to address.
Thank you for that. I agree, and I think your book does so well at capturing the danger and the fear of this weaponizing of the sacred. Like it is, the book has weight to it in how it unfolds this argument. And I think it is, that fear and that danger is so well captured. So we've been talking about the way this othering works to demonize, to inflict violence on, but the book also seeks to look at the way otherness doesn't have to solely be an empire building strategy. It can also provide the way to a healing strategy. The way, otherness can be the way into this borderland hermeneutic. So can you talk a little bit about how this kind of reconfiguring of otherness and diversity actually can, take these other tools and kind of counterintuitively flip the system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's what Gloria Anzaldúa teaches us in a lot of the wisdom that she has provided in Borderlands and then in her later writings before she passed away. And you know, it's a really quite ingenious but simple paradigm, and that has to do with the notion that sacred is otherworldly. So that concept I built further on and sought to expound further, and thinking of how when sacred is encountered, you know, whether it be through some form of spirituality, meditation, sacred texts, religious practice, there's an otherness present within those movements, and that, I think, is something that, you know, if you know, I'm not starting from the divine image ethic. Now, that's something that I think has been written on extensively, and there's a number of good ethicists and theologians who can expound upon, you know, the importance of you know, human worth because of the divine image present in all humans. So I was wanting to pivot differently from Gloria Anzaldua's work and naming the sacred as intrinsically other. And there's already you know, it's a convincing logic on in its simplicity. It's quite compelling that to think of other not as some existential threat or an evil that then we need to respond to through violence, but that the other, because it's other to us, is a sacred domain. So turning to the other in that sense is where I then try and develop an approach to human care. And of course, curanderismo is a practice that is very familiar in the US-Mexico borderlands. It is this informal healthcare system that is channeling nativist thought, Native American thought, Native American practice. It's also channeling Catholic spiritualism, and there's also this localized understanding of then, you know, how it's expressed. So all of these various strains that are informing curanderismo, for me, manifest are sort of a reification of what turning to the other as sacred means. Is you know, turning to plants, turning to aromas, turning to combinations of, you know, the space and the ambiance, certain objects, all of these various things that would be considered maybe in some formal settings as heretical, but there's something that taps into that otherness as sacred. And if, you know, if we could this is you could say maybe a post-colonial move. It is a decolonizing move to give worth to epistemologies that are outside of Western European philosophical traditions. It's the unseen, the unwritten, the oral histories, all of those elements that we find, that are not part of the professional literature. That's what I'm turning to.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think when you write about, like later in the book, about the curandera praxis, and as a way of, an indictment of the kind of state-constructed spaces of human care in privileging well-being over commodification. I think that's a really powerful section of the book in pointing to the way, like, that even the way state-sponsored care has been kind of brought into this whole other weaponizing thing, and so to go beyond that, something that's so other for so many who are not from this region is and the care you take in talking about these processes and what it is about bringing helping to reclaim or restore the sacred in bodies that have been desacralized is, I think, a really important move in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm looking at what you just described in comparison to the state-sanctioned vaccination that was imposed upon a Mexican-American neighborhood in Laredo during the 1899 smallpox epidemic, and how they were immediately deemed the bearer of the virus. They were the ones who were the diseased, the unclean, the ones that needed to be quarantined. So this is the expression of what you would think safe healthcare approach, where you want to vaccinize a population in order to maintain public health, through a racial logic, ends up actually doing more harm than good. And curanderismo as a alternative, as not so much an alternative, but as the other way of approaching healthcare, you find elements in the approach that I think would be a far more public health benefit, even if it's just the way you understand the body and the presence of people within the room that involves the healing performance. There's something there that we can learn an enormous amount about how to heal humans in ways that give them worth, right? And so there's, I hadn't thought about the current situation that we find ourselves in, or the current global public health crisis, but I think that curanderos could offer us some very compelling wisdom and how to create spaces of healing for people, rather than seeing human beings as objects for surveillance and commodification, right? And political advancement. What is it that we could do to invent or transform the way in which healthcare providers approach people who are confronting serious healthcare issues, and so this is an attempt to at least bring that to discussion. It's not as full as I would have liked it, but I wanted to at least give enough framework to this approach to health, to healing, that there could be some discussion about the current approaches that are used by this, especially by state power.
Thank you for that. Just to stay with healing a little bit. Early on, you established that the book seeks to, attend in a healing way to the recurring wounds of post-coloniality, open wound at the US-Mexico border. As you kind of mentioned at the outset, this book came from, your own life, your own lived experience, your own location, your own family history, and it also then attends to wounds that are personal. As much as you're willing to, how was it to try to approach to write this book? When it is so close to the lived experience, close to things that are real threats, and and real wounds.
Well, one of the things that I would do when I would write on, write a section for the book is I would light an incense and a candle. Those are two important elements that curanderos teach us in setting the room for what you're going to engage, the voices that are at stake in rereading this history and reconceptualizing it, theorizing on pain, theorizing on the violence that has been experienced firsthand by members of my own family, what it means to be displaced as small business owners, to be intimidated, to be thought of as insignificant, as not being able to contribute to mainstream society. This white supremacist mentality that permeates institutional life, whether it be in education, in finding a profession. There are wounds that go back to ancestors, and I could feel the weight of those wounds when I would come to the computer and begin to write. And I could hear voices. I could hear my grandmother's voice. I could hear sayings and jokes. These are, and even the unheard stories. You know that there's pain and just the animosity that is felt by many still who are of ethnic Mexican in the U.S. Southwest, who can, who go back to, their family goes back prior to the formation of the U.S.-Mexico border. There's this generational pain and trauma that osmotically is transferred, and you don't know the fullness of it. You can't articulate its exactness, but you have its aura. It possesses you, and you need to get it out. You need to speak about it. I think of the story of Cain and Abel. The blood, it still cries out in the land. There's still blood being shed on the U.S.-Mexico border, but the blood that has been shed unjustly since the formation of the border, it cries out.
Thank you for that. I Yeah, that's very powerful, and I think we benefit very much from the witness you provide and the work that you have. So I appreciate the work that it took, and I hope that many others do as they turn to this book. I guess a kind of a question as we're kind of coming into land. We never know, especially with books which take a long time to produce, that they can come out in 2020 and then 2020 looks a lot different than everyone suspected, as you even started to hint at a bit with the talking about the healing and things like that. And obviously when COVID kind of was first happening, around the world, one of the first things that everyone or politicians sought to attend to was borders. We'll close borders and things like that, and the US was quick to do that, even if I think it was pointed out so maybe somewhat the logic of it, given that there were many more cases in the US than in Mexico. So I just curious about how with that borders became such a, again, understandably a kind of a point of political interest and rhetoric. How has anything in this kind of from thinking about the book for so long and then coming into this context, is it just like, yep, absolutely as expected? Could have seen that was going to be a point, or anything that's kind of surprised you in the way that the language has happened, or anything that maybe people can be attentive to when they start to hear this conversation happening? Because again, you're like, oh yes, we have to be careful and safe, and you'll hear stories about, well, yes, New Zealand did so good because they shut their borders very early and things like that. And so it almost becomes this kind of justifying thing for what potentially could be lasting a lot longer than the present circumstances.
Yeah, I think early on, the political rhetoric that was coming out of the White House began to connect Chinese nationals with the virus, and then pivoted quickly to the US-Mexico border and the need for increased border security. And for me, that echoed clearly the 1899 smallpox epidemic, and how the state, in declaring the need for public health and safety, created this demonized other as the originator of the virus, and that then justified increased border security and the use of violence. So the Texas Rangers were deployed to the neighborhood that was refusing to be vaccinated, in large part because they were drawing on their curanderismo as an approach to smallpox, feeling that that was a much more appropriate approach to their health, and one that they could trust. And so when the state came in with this paramilitary force to impose quarantine, impose vaccinations in ways that were dehumanizing, right? So this mentality of using the issue of health as a sacred domain, so it's converting it into a sacred domain, that the need to protect our citizenry from the infection of this virus, that is a sacred narrative. And then it elevates because it's attaching to other sacred elements like citizenship and sovereignty, the border integrity. All of these elements come to play when you're talking about the health of your citizenry. And so it just unfolds again in textbook fashion. And I always try to tell my students, if you could just read 19th century political rhetoric, it's the same rhetoric that we're hearing today. It's the same tactic. It's the same investment in manifest destiny. It's the same strategy. What has surprised me is that we are still being manipulated by this long-standing approach, the same operations of power, of elite power, And that's, I think, what's not only it's surprising that we haven't caught on, but it is also a bit frustrating.
Thank you for that. And I think like that's, as we're finishing thinking about like, that, part of the first step of working toward resacralizing the other is realizing that there has been a desacralizing process at play for a long time that just takes on, puts on a new hat, but doesn't change much about it. If there's a second step that you would just like to leave people with, if that first step is, as they're obviously the first step, of course, is picking up the book and reading the book and realizing this process that has taken place. If you're thinking there's some sort of small second step that you would want to encourage or leave people with in that, who want to get on side of this resacralizing the other and seeing that other as sacred and not as ourselves as sacred, and to protect ourselves from some anti-sacred otherness, is there something you want to leave us with here? And it doesn't have to be, because it doesn't, certainly not a simple thing, but I just thought I'd offer that.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to theorizing on violence and offering a critical response to how elite power has dehumanized people of color and used their demonization for their own, its own perpetuation. It's being vigilant of how the sacred is working, and to be an auditor of sacred investments in the sacred, whether it be in your local church, whether it be in your community of faith, to be not just a willful consumer of theology and going with what you sense is having currency, but to audit the sacred, and even beyond just religious domains, to see how it's working in political arenas. And we've been, I think in the West, since modernity, sort of led to see religious thought, religious ideas, the sacred, as an area that will, at some point in the future, diminish in its importance. That secularity will overcome the sacred, but it hasn't gone away. I mean, we're seeing the sacred being a place of healing, as you could see in most cities across the world, how migrant populations occupy buildings that were once thought to be for secular use and have become now used for places of worship. The sacred is not going to go away, and so that's, I think, a beautiful thing. It's a hopeful thing that there is this draw to the sacred, but it's also the other side of it, right? Where there is the continual appeal and recourse to the sacred, there are state elite power structures that will most definitely seek to invest in those realms of authority and then repurpose them to create worlds that run counter to much of religious thought. And that has to do with the liberation of human beings.
Thank you for that. And that's an excellent spot to end. So the book is Resacralizing the Other at the US-Mexico Border, a Borderland Hermeneutic, out with Routledge. Pick it up if you can, or if you're at a seminary or theological college, tell your librarian to get it in. Gregory, anything else you want to plug? Any other ways people can connect with you, or classes you want to let people know about? Anything you want to draw our attention to at this moment?
Well, thank you so much, Liam, for the invitation to speak about this work. I look forward to future book reviews or responses anyone may have. This is not the end all of the topic. I'm hoping that it opens up the conversation as you have done so here. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for that.